Well, thank you, Augie, for that very kind introduction. Actually, I am the one person here who is not an expert in this area at all. I know nothing about energy and electricity markets except what I read in the last 3 days trying to prepare for this. And this morning, I had the big surprise when there was a new version of the paper. So if the EPDP people see that their download numbers have gone up in the last 3 days, because I kept downloading the paper from the website. I was assigned this task, and unfortunately, the people who assigned me this task didn't want to give me any comments. So all the comments that I have are my own, and I did not get any reaction from any of my colleagues. So I guess they don't want to be implicated in case I say something stupid. Okay. So anyway, so let me begin my comments. Obviously, my comments are not going to be along the technical lines that the other commentators, especially the Germans, have. But my first comment, in general, I first looked at how the research question in the paper was framed. And the general question, based on my understanding and on the title of the study itself, is how the energy sector can contribute to attaining the goal of 2040 ambition to raise per capita income to $6,873 in constant 2000 prices, to move the country to upper middle income status by 2040. Now, the way the authors operationalize and translate this sort of goal is to ask the question, how can the price of electricity be lowered by reducing generation charges, which make up 47% of the total electricity bill, via changing the generating fuel mix? Okay. Now, to begin with, in the abstract of the paper, I noticed that this general sort of broad research question versus the specific thing that they, how they operationalized it, that hierarchy is somewhat reversed in the sense that the narrower study task of finding a way to reduce generation costs by changing fuel mix is given prominence and forms the basis of the methodology, the numerical exercises in the paper. So, for example, they say, quote, "This paper also provides an assessment of the power sector's performance and suggests broad key reforms and alternative pathways needed for the sector to contribute to the overall vision of a strong growth economy and improved well-being of Filipinos by 2040. And now, in the previous paper which I was reading until Wednesday, the previous version, a lower electricity price was stated as being an indicator of well-being. Well, Maha said the same thing today. An improvement in well-being being what the authors understand the aim of 2040 ambition to be. I noticed also that in this current version, there's not much mention of ambition 2040, where it was like, in front of everything in the previous version. Now, I think initially the intention was to link well-being to lower electricity prices achieved via greater efficiency. But of course, a lower electricity price is not necessarily an indicator of well-being, and neither is a high per capita GDP, for many reasons. I mean, Viking already said in his presentation, if you take into account all of these externalities and correctly price carbon emissions, etc., the price might actually be high, all right? But welfare may actually improve. So that's one of the things that I want to point out. Then what really struck me was the way the research question was eventually operationalized, for the simple reason that this research team is made up of economists. And I think if I were given a research topic like this, I would want to attack it from a position of comparative advantage. And it seems to me that the comparative advantage of the team is in economics, not these very technical scientific things. And I'm sort of pretty sure that, an industry expert, an engineer, an energy person who may have no knowledge of economics can churn out the same kind of numerical exercises that they do, tweaking fuel mixes to come up with lower generation costs. So I just think that if we have a team of economists doing a study on power security and competitiveness, I would hope that they would attack the research question from a position of strength, from where they have a comparative advantage. And one contribution, I think, is in helping craft the appropriate regulatory environment to set the right incentive structure facing market participants who, of course, act in their own self-interest in the different markets in the sector and seeing the resulting price and output outcomes. So economists know something about setting incentives, okay? The authors cite RA 9136, or the EPIRA of 2001. And in the intro, I was struck by what Joya Brenica said in her 2014 study, that EPIRA, quote, marked the departure from a centrally managed, highly regulated structure to a decentralized market-oriented system. The expected reduction in electricity prices and the investments boost in the sector have not taken place, unquote. As an economist, I would have taken my cue from this and tried to find out why this Reform Act and the resulting regulatory structure have not resulted in lower electricity prices. Because I think an economist would have a comparative advantage in this, rather than in a purely or mostly technical kind of study. Another contribution, as an economist, would be to estimate the cost of externalities in power generation and other activities in the sector and charge the appropriate taxes and ensure that prices reflect true social marginal costs. So this is something that Viking just talked about. The second point is that in economics, we know that there are many variables that may affect something we want to explain. For example, we say quantity demanded of a good is a function of the price of the good, income, prices of other goods, tastes, size of the population. So there are lots of things that affect a phenomenon that we're trying to explain. What moves or what matters for quantity demanded. And what we do is we abstract from this complexity and focus on the factor that we think is most important and or most interesting. Now, in this study, on page 2, Raul Fabelia's 2016 study is cited, and in that study states, quote, several factors explain the Philippines' high power costs. These include fuel mix, taxes and subsidies, low reserves and low generation capacity per capita, average size of generation plants, overall efficiency, volatility, and absence of competition in power supply agreements, contracting, quote. My question is the fuel mix the most important factor that affects generation costs? I ask because, again, in Joya Brenica's 2014 paper, which, by the way, I found by accident, in my desire to keep downloading the EPDP paper, I went to the UP website. And then on the front page of the UP website, I saw these policy briefs, and then I saw this paper. There's a policy brief by Joya Brenica on competitive pricing electricity markets. I said, I better look at this because I don't know anything about electricity markets. So I found this paper, and Joya Brenica in 2014 states, quote, part of the explanation why electricity rates are obstinately high is the paucity of investments, despite growing demand and liberalization of entry into the generation business. As prices rise due to the tightening of supply, investments in new generation capacity should have been forthcoming, if the policy environment is in shape. But extensive licensing agreements and bureaucratic red tape are dampening the appetite of investors. Thus, from 2001 to 2013, only 652 megawatts was added to installed capacity in Luzon, unquote, and goes on. Now, I ask because the current version of this paper under Roman 1, Baseline Assessment of Power Sector Performance on page 4, discusses the importance of investment and the fact that investment targets are not being met and have not been met for a while. It says, quote, on the other hand, the private investment rate will not rise to desired levels unless the known hurdles to investment are cleared. The almost unbearably lengthy, costly licensing procedures, the highly uncertain and sometimes inconsistent nature of regulation, the high cost of doing business, and the closing off of many areas, agriculture and mining, to large-scale investment projects, unquote. On page 17, the paper says, for the energy sector, the power subsector in particular, long-term visioning is of prime importance as investments in most new facilities for generation and transmission are lumpy in nature. It takes several years to put up a baseload power plant, especially when environmental and social impact studies are required. This is critical to plan ahead and coordinate the power requirement and the corresponding generation and transmission that will support the vision of strong growth, unquote. Now, one of the EPDP consultants, Professor Del Mundo, states in his slide presentation, there's one slide in his presentation, that he presented this paper at the conference in January. Quote, key to significantly reducing the price of electricity in the Philippines is to prioritize security of supply through A, long-term power supply contracting for new generation capacity, which avoids the high-priced privatized legacy power plants and IPP contracts of NPC and allows GenCos to seek least cost. Existing power plants must be given only short-term contracts, 1 to 5 years, while long-term contracts, 10 to 25 years, must be reserved only to new power generation capacity, and B, competitive power supply procurement process, unquote. My next question is, why this lack of investments in power generation, cited by Joya Brenica in 2014, by Del Mundo, and in the current version of the study under number 1 baseline assessment, did not seemingly figure into the research question and methodology of the study, and why the study focused on lowering generation costs via the search for an optimal fuel mix. Abrenica's 2014 paper on page 9 further states, quote, to produce electricity at least cost, the system should have the right mix of base load, mid-merit, and peaking plants to accommodate peaks and troughs in demand. So I found out that there is such a thing as plant mix, and this is different from fuel mix, which is what this paper is about. On page 28 of the current paper, quote, the next step, so when I read this, I looked at page 28 of this current paper, which said, quote, the next step is to compute the % share of installed capacity for each load for the 3 grids. For simplicity, we lump together mid-merit, peaking, and ancillary loads as one, unquote. So my question is, given what Joy said on page 9 of her 2014 paper, if this makes sense. I'm so sorry. Number 3 has to do with the methodology that is used in the study. There is a simultaneity problem, and there are many endogenous variables, but the study was divided into different studies rather than having the variables estimated simultaneously. So first, it took me a long time to figure this out. I read, the paper like many times to figure out what was going on. So output growth rates were first derived based on the requirement to have per capita income of 6,873 by 2040. Now, next, these required annual growth rates in output, as well as the price of electricity, were used as explanatory variables in a regression which estimated energy consumption demand all the way to 2040. So output growth and the price of electricity are exogenous in the modeling of consumption demand. But we know that the price of electricity and energy consumption affect output growth. Next, the estimated consumption demand for electricity is then used in the numerical exercises to get first the necessary supply of power to be generated to meet the consumption demand, and then produced under different mixes of the different fuel mixes, and then this spits out the generation cost. But again, the electricity price affects consumption demand for electricity. So in the numerical exercises, output growth is exogenous. So it's unclear how generation costs and electricity prices affect output growth. So now I can show just a little model in the way I tried to understand how, how one could deal with simultaneity. Basically, how come the equations are not there? There are no equations? I had a little model of the energy sector, which starts out with the sectoral production supply function for coal, geothermal, hydro, etc. Then a sectoral demand for it. Then I had an aggregate energy production function, which was aggregated using some kind of Armington aggregation function. And then from that, I get a price index for energy. I then use that to derive a supply of electricity, then a demand for electricity as a function of the price of electricity, and finally, this feeds into equilibrium GDP. Okay, so you can have an equilibrium GDP macro model with a energy kind of sub-model, so that there is a connection between what's happening to energy prices and supply and output. In this model, in the current paper, there is no link from generation cost, price of electricity, and output. There's none. Okay. I asked Rolly Danau, who, together with Jeff, estimated this consumption demand for electricity, about the projected trend in electricity prices and temperature in that equation. And he told me that this historical trend in electricity prices was based on a logarithmic trend. Now, I asked him if he tried other ways to model this trend, and he said he did not, but I would just say that if you change the model of the way you model the historical trend, you could pretty much probably change the price trend and therefore the resulting consumption demand forecasts. And if these change, then all the projections in the numerical exercises will likewise change. So output growth is exogenous in this study. It only enters the equation for estimating consumption demand, electricity consumption demand. Now, I found that it was curious that there's a difference in the reasoning about what leads to economic growth along the 2040 path. In the earlier version of the paper, on page 4, I quote, this high growth trajectory will be achieved through the demographic dividend, unquote. Reducing fertility rates is the critical element for the demographic transition. In this current version, however, on page 14, this sort of got watered down because I quote, accompanying this high economic growth is the well-known demographic dividend. So now it seems like there is no causal relationship between the demographic dividend and output growth. I think there was a desire to weaken this because in the beginning, in the earlier version, really the output growth numbers were obtained without reference at all to power costs or power prices or power supply. There is reference to Raul and Sarah's paper on development progeria But that paper, I believe, attributed development progeria to a Dutch disease effect coming from currency overvaluation and the role of institutions, not to power costs. So, finally, the key reforms and alternative pathways needed for the sector to contribute to the overvision. Policy recommendations section, which, as Adora said, are the most important and most interesting aspect of this paper. I would say that these recommendations, to which we economists can legitimately contribute, are not naturally derived from the numerical exercises done in the paper at all. This section could have been written without ever having done the numerical exercises. So when you have, policy recommendations like there should be, investment coordination in generation, transmission, and distribution, this does not fall out of or we should do something about electric cooperatives. It has nothing to do with all these numbers that they crunched out in the paper. Now, what do competitive outcomes look like in the electricity market? Here, this is something we can say something about. And again, I cite Joya Brenica's paper, 2014. She doesn't know this. She didn't know that I saw her paper. But anyways, it says, quote, price greater than industry marginal costs is normally a sign of a lack of market competition, but not in electricity markets, since this serves to compensate the capacity of plants that are seldom used. Without this compensation, there's no incentive to build peaking plants, which are necessary to maintain an optimal mix of generation and hence produce electricity at least cost, unquote. She continues, quote, a number of factors are critical for effective competition in the electricity market, including the adequacy of reserve margins and the number of competing generators. Distributors should manage their portfolio well. Customers should counter the market power of generators through demand responses. There should be effective monitoring and surveillance, unquote. So, at the very least, I would suggest that the authors do a more complete literature survey, starting with Joya Brenica's PCED policy note, designing a competitive electricity market. Now, I saw, when I did research, I Googled, okay, electricity, price of electricity, Philippines competition, and I saw there was a citation there. Adora had a paper in PIDS where, in fact, she shows even if you reduce transmission losses, the price is still high. The price of electricity is still high. Ling Ling Patalinghud had a paper also. There was somebody from NCPAG that had a paper. There's so many papers out there on the Philippine electricity market which are not cited in this paper, which I think is a no-no for research. Instead, if you can cite Dawa and Fabelia's paper where they talk about progeria but never actually use the findings in this paper to make a connection between power rates and manufacturing growth, or cite Jeff's paper on remittances. I don't know where that came in the paper. I think you should do a more extensive literature survey. And finally, I'm sorry it took so much time. I would suggest that certain statements which are not germane to the paper and which may have political undertones be deleted. For example, on page 4, quote, on the one hand, the government will be hard-pressed to try to reach this level of government capital outlay unless it addresses the causes of the spending gridlock and miserable absorptive capacity. This problem cannot be addressed by simply creating facile corruption-prone programs of entitlements, e.g. PDAF, unquote. I don't think, First of all, the problems alluded to, spending gridlock and miserable absorptive capacity, predate PDAF. So you cannot impute a causal relationship here. You know, what you can do maybe is include other things like cumbersome government procurement laws, lack of expertise in the preparation of technical proposals, etc., that plague not only this sector, but PPP and everything else that we want to do in this country. But I think this is a very, for me, kind of a politically loaded question. It came from left field. So I would delete it. That's all I had to say. Thank you.